In the previous video, we determined that we were going to need something in order to be able to create multiple variables that might have the same name. In order to figure out what variable gets precedence in a particular location when we're executing our code, we're going to have to talk about what's called the scope of a variable, which is some sort of area of the program where we can totally, unambiguously access the value that's associated with that variable and the variable's name. That concept that we're looking for is called the scope. So far, as we've been writing programs that all execute within this document called main inside of our Python programs, we have encountered variables mostly that have what's called global scope, meaning that the names and the values that are associated with our variables are accessible absolutely everywhere. That's what global scope means. However, when we first introduced functions, we were now creating an environment where we could have something called local scope, where we can create a variable and give a name to that variable. However, we're only able to access the contents of that variable when we're within a certain block of code. And in this particular example, when we're inside of a function definition. You should note that the scope of a variable, that is, where we're able to access the variable and the contents of that variable, is entirely determined by where you either define or assign values to that variable. For example, parameters of functions are things that have local scope. Those variables are only accessible within the function that you are defining. On the contrary, variables that are declared in the main part of our program have what's called global scope. To give an example to help you understand what's going on, I've maintained this function from our first example, the printlist function. The printlist function uses a parameter called myList. After declaring what our function will be, we begin coding the body of our function. And in Python, that's all of this code that is indented from the function definition. This right here, lines 2 and 3 for this example, is the scope of the variable myList. Anything within the body of the function definition can talk about the variable myList and can access its values. Anything outside the definition of this function is not able to access anything in the list myList or any of its values. As an example, if I move outside of the body of the function definition and just ask my program to print the contents of myList, Python will tell us that myList is not defined. This is an example where you're attempting to access a local variable outside of its scope, and this creates an error. On the other hand, let's look at this slightly modified code. I'm keeping the same function definition, printlist, that takes in this parameter, myList, and prints out its contents, but I've done something a little bit silly. Outside of the scope of this function, I've defined two different lists, this list and that list. This list has the values ABC inside of the list, while that list has the values 1, 2, 3. If we, inside of our function printlist, try to access this list in order to print its contents, when we call the printlist function, only passing it that list as an argument, the function is still able to print the values of this list, as is shown over here on the right. And the reasoning for that is that this list is a global variable, and it can be accessed from anywhere, even locally, within the function definition. This is part of what makes scope such an interesting thing to study from a computer science perspective is that one misunderstanding of scope will lead to an error or a problem with your syntax, while the other misinterpretation of scope can lead to complicated semantic errors as you're working within your code, because there's absolutely no technical problem with this code below, but there's all sorts of potential for your functions to do strange things to variables that the function shouldn't even know about, and that can be a dangerous thing as you're coding.